Hello, folks. This is Michelle Ehrhardt, editor from Tom's Hardware, here with another edition of the Tom's Hardware Show. Last week, we gave you all kind of a preview of Intel's new Alder Lake platform, but our review is finally up, and we have benchmarks to show you. And joining me are Jared Walton and Matt Safford to talk about their different testing and expertise that they have with this chip. So without further ado, let's roll the thing. So hello, folks. Welcome to the Tom's Hardware Show. Once again, joining me today are Jared Walton, senior editor, and Matt Safford, managing editor. Matt and Jared, how are you doing?
Doing good.
Not too bad. More well slept than Paul is, I think.
That is why Paul is not here.
Yeah, so today Intel's new Alder Lake chips are out. The review embargo is up. We have benchmarks to show you, but our reviewer just, was burning the midnight oil trying to get that out. So, and he has a number of calls today, even it never stops. So today we have Matt and Jared subbing in to talk about Alder Lake Forum. So, guys, I have a number of the benchmarks pulled up to the side, but before we get to those, what are your general thoughts on Alder Lake? This is Intel's first desktop 10 nanometer process chip. People are calling it a huge generational refresh. The way it's handling performance versus efficiency cores is real new, and the pricing seems super competitive. So, what's your take?
You can go first, Jared.
So, I mean, it's about damn time. Like, I'm not saying that that Intel needs to be in the lead, but this 14 nanometer business dragged on for just so long.
And on and on and on.
Yeah, like Intel was literally 2 years solidly ahead of the competition when it moved to 14 nanometer with Broadwell, where the laptop chips launched in late 2014. The desktop chips showed up in 2015, so did Skylake, and we sat on 14 nanometer Intel for the next 6 generations. Like, that's horrible.
One of the first things that I learned at CES 2018, like 3 days into this job, was 10 nanometer Intel is delayed. And that was 4 years ago in a month and a half or 2 months from now, right?
Yeah, I joined Tom's
Hardware.
Canceled. I joined Tom's Hardware maybe a year and a half ago, and shortly after I joined too, 10 nanometer Intel delayed again 4 years later. So yeah, it's finally here.
And it's finally on desktop. And I have nothing against laptop users. I mean, more power to you. I've got laptops, and I use them when I travel and such. But I'm a bit of a homebody, and COVID has made all of us homebodies more or less. So, I'm all about having a high performance desktop. And when you saw what AMD was getting from TSMC's 7 nanometer process, and then you look at Intel and you're like, really? Comet Lake? Then Rocket Lake? It's just like, we need something better. And so that something better is finally here. And kind of as Intel did with Conroe, it pulled out a lot of the stops. I'm not going to say this is a Conroe moment, because Conroe, that was their Core 2 Duo. It basically improved generational performance by like 20 to 50%, depending on what you were doing, sometimes even more. It was a huge jump. And this is not 50% faster, I don't think, in any workloads. There are cases where it's over 20% faster, but they also have this business with the thread director, hybrid cores. ARM has had hybrid architectures for, gosh, I don't know, like at least 5 or 6 years, maybe more. Big Little is what they called it, and Intel calls it Big Bigger. Which, whatever. But anyway, it's like, because ARM is used with Linux and Android operating systems more, the OS developers have been quick to adapt to hybrid architectures where you have faster cores and slower cores, and the OS needs to know how to schedule things. With Windows, like Windows is a bit of it's a monolithic beast. It's so huge and complex that Microsoft has trouble changing things radically. And, the things they do change radically often fail. Not looking at you, Windows 11 UI. Yes, I am. But
Well, you
so,
might need Windows 11 to get the full
yes.
power out of this chip, which is interesting because we've had things to say about Windows 11 before, but we'll get into that a little bit later. For now, let's start looking at the chip itself, sort of basic specs and stuff. So we showed this off last week, but here's just a photo of the actual chips themselves next to some Ryzen chips. Our editor Paul, who wrote up our review, took that photo, and I just wanted to show you what they look like. They're pretty small, which is interesting because they're also pretty powerful, so that can have a good effect on the thermals. But for right now, let's go ahead and dig into the hardcore numbers.
What I would love with those pictures of the chips, like you don't get the full comparison because you're seeing heat spreaders there. I would love to see like the die shot comparisons. We don't have those, but if you delidded all of those chips, because some of those chips are much larger under the heat spreader than others. In fact, even if you look at the Ryzen heat spreader compared to Alder Lake, they don't look that much different, but physically, I think, well, Ryzen's a bit weird because it's got chiplets, right? With the 5900X, 5950X, you have two compute chiplets with the CPU dies, and then you have one IO chiplet. And so, like, it would be very interesting to see, but I don't think Paul plans on delidding and possibly rooting all of his processors. But I'd especially love to see, like, the Xeon chip delidded, because that thing is a beast. It's so huge. And that's why it's also so expensive. Anyway,
100%.
Specs.
It would definitely be very interesting to delid those chips. We could talk about that a bit more when we talk about stock. People might be mad at us if we ruin our own chips.
Yeah.
Although Intel does have its own fab, so
yeah.
You might actually be able to buy this one.
He can show them.
Yeah. So here are the actual specs themselves compared to the Ryzen. The 12900K, or /KF, depending on which one you get, topping out at 589 and 564 versus the Ryzen 9 5950X topping out at 799. What are your thoughts on those prices and the specs overall, guys?
I mean, pricing's definitely aggressive, but I think it's about time. Intel has the size and the cash reserves to kind of on some level price things however they want to a certain extent. So I think after a long time where it felt like they were charging a lot for what they were offering, I mean, this is somewhat refreshing, although that's not taking into account what the actual street prices will be, which I've already seen Amazon, the Core i9 selling on Amazon for $1,600. So
I mean, even Micro Center, I saw an email from them today, and Micro Center is traditionally it's like the place to go if you need a CPU, if you have a store near you, because they only sell in store. And they were selling, I think, $320 for the 12600K, which is like $40 more, and I want to say it was like $650 or some such for the 12900K. So they're getting in on the action too. But I mean, the reality is, I think the prices here are good. They're probably where they should be. I think you've got like the 5950X. It's a little expensive. It's very much that Halo product that most people don't really need. It's a 250 jump from the 5900X, which tends to be better for gaming purposes as well. The 11900K, the previous gen Intel, I think those were just overpriced. Like, I don't know anyone personally who actually went out and bought Rocket Lake. It's not that it was horrible, but it was not great. And especially when we knew Alder Lake was coming, it was like, I would just wait another year if you can do so.
From the beginning, Yeah, from the beginning with Rocket Lake, I was like, this reminds me of Broadwell. Like, it just feels like a stopgap. When you knew there was a new generation coming in like 6 to 8 months, it's like, I mean, yeah, if you have to buy something, go for it. But
So this
Yeah.
is actually a great transition into the next interesting thing on this chart. What are E-cores from the board 999? So this is the one of the big new additions with this chip is the split between performance and efficiency cores. So if you'll notice the Ryzen, let's look at the 5950X, this is right here, 16 productivity cores, i9 12900KF, 8 productivity or performance cores and 8 efficiency cores. Same amount of cores, but they're split up differently. What are your thoughts on that, Jared? Seems like you have stuff to say.
So this is the big change with Alder Lake. I said earlier a hybrid architecture. P cores, performance cores, they're the Golden Cove architecture. That's like the latest generation. So you had oh shoot, Ice Lake was a different. I'm drawing a blank on the Cove name. Anyway, your CPU,
Sunny coat? No.
yeah, Sunny Cove,
I got it.
and then sorry, not Comet Lake. Rocket Lake was the gosh, what was it? Not Crystal. Anyway, Rocket Lake had a different cove that was basically Ice Lake Sunny Cove ported to 14 nanometer, back ported because it was a larger process, right? That's not good. Golden Cove is the first real major desktop architecture change since Skylake back in 2015. So, like, I guess you can count the Rocket Lake architecture was a change, but it's supposed to be 20% faster IPC or 20% higher IPC instructions per clock. That's a huge deal. It's still the hyper threading, so each core has the capability of running 2 threads and all that stuff. Then you have the efficiency cores, and they're called Gracemont, and it's what happened to Intel's Atom chips. Those architectures have still chugged along, and now Gracemont is the latest iteration. And according to what I've talked with Paul about this, is Gracemont is a lot like a Skylake core. Actually, it's kind of better than Skylake in some ways, but very small. And if you were to look at the die shot of the Alder Lake chip, so just basically you get like a performance core, say is this big, then you get a block that's the same size, and that has 4 efficiency cores stuffed into it. They're much lower power. They're great for lighter tasks, and if you schedule things properly, you can do stuff like encoding or streaming or just lighter workloads that aren't necessarily needing the full Golden Cove architecture advantages, and they use a lot less power. So they're still fast, but they're not as fast, and they use less power, and that's kind of what you get. And you need to intelligently schedule things to the proper cores so that you're not burning power by scheduling low power tasks to the high power cores, and you're also not running slow by accidentally scheduling high performance tasks to the low performance cores.
Exactly.
which
So
means you
I'm
need
getting
Windows
a
11.
commenter. Speed ROM 2. Where are the benchmarks? They're ready to. They're chomping at the bit. But before we get into that, I do want to ask one quick question, Jared, because to the sort of, I guess, untrained listener, it could sound to me like, oh, they're just putting 8 terrible cores in next to the good cores to make it seem like they have 16 cores when they don't. But from what we reviewed about this chip, we liked it. That's clearly not the case. So, like aside from,
Yeah.
drawing lower power, why would I care about or want an efficiency core over just another performance core?
So the interesting thing here is, like, based on what I know, they're kind of like a Skylake core, which is kind of like a KB Lake, kind of like a Coffee Lake, kind of like a Comet Lake core. They're clocked a little bit lower. They're far more efficient. So my PC sitting to the side of me is running a Core i9 9900K. That has 8 cores and 16 threads. There's no hyperthreading on these efficiency cores, but in effect, it's almost like having a 9700K plus the bigger, faster 8-core, 16-thread Golden Cove side of things. So they're not slow. They're just not as potent in terms of performance. And if you're like most people, you'll do a lot of tasks where you're not really going to need like it's like people don't need Threadripper. Like if you're doing
Mm-hmm.
video production work, yes, Threadripper's great. If you're surfing the internet, answering email, it's a waste. It's totally overkill.
Exactly.
Laptops are really going to benefit because I think you'll see laptops in lighter usage scenarios, which is probably what 95% of business work entails. They can power off the P cores completely, not even spin them up. And so now you potentially have a chip that's using a few watts of power, whereas like the P cores would probably kick that into that 10-watt range
Yep.
or more.
So let's go ahead and move on into those benchmarks that people are waiting for. So here's one of our benchmarks. Let's go ahead and just jump right into the gaming. This is our average FPS across our entire test suite of games alongside an RTX 3090. We have 1440p charts too, but let's go ahead and start with the 1080p. The types of games we tested here were Far Cry 6, Horizon Zero Dawn, Flight Simulator. You can't see me counting because my name's in the way. But yeah, we see topping off the chart, we see the 12900K DDR5, 12900K DDR4. Then we go to the sort of Ryzen equivalents for that. Then oddly enough, we see an 11900K in there. And then we go to the sort of lower levels, the i5s and the Ryzen 7s, etc. So, we have Intel at the top of the charts with competitive pricing. What are your thoughts, guys?
I mean, this doesn't tell the whole story because it's a geometric mean. It's the average across 7 games that Paul tested. And even at 1080p, I believe he used the mostly high preset or very high, or, it varies by game a little bit. But he and I talked about this a lot to try and figure out like what's our test suite going to be for 2022 and going forward on the CPU gaming side. And so these are different games than we've tested in the past, not because we're trying to like favor Intel, but because a lot of our test suite was like 3 or 4 years old and it's time to update. So, we'll get to the individual results, but overall to see, I believe it's an 8.9 or something percent increase of Alder Lake's 12900K over the 11900K. And that's a pretty sizable jump, especially in gaming where it's like, hey, this isn't sloped the way you would see if it were pure CPU performance. We're still hitting GPU bottlenecks, but you still got 9% faster with a 3090, and you're running at 1080p, which people with a 3090 probably won't do. But it's to show the potential of the CPUs. So generally, generational 9% improvements pretty large, as you can see, looking at some of the other chips on there.
Exactly. So I don't have the entirety of the individual games pulled up, but let's just look at Far Cry 6 just for an instant, or just for an example. So we have the Core i9 at 156, which is, I'm terrible at math, 12 higher than the Ryzen 9 5900X. And then the rest of the differences aren't quite so stark. But again, it'll differ from game to game. Let me just look up at Horizon Zero Dawn real quick. So Horizon Zero Dawn has, hold on a second. Let me just go ahead and bring my my browser over here. Has these results. So we have the 12900K at 189 and the Ryzen 9 950 at 183.
So the interesting thing too is like if you flip back to the Far Cry 6 result, like DDR5 performed way better than DDR4 on the 12900K, but on other games it flips. And I think some of that's just going to be teething pains is the BIOS properly optimized? Is the game properly optimized for Windows 11 and the new thread director? Like, there's all these factors that are going to come into play. And Paul also has Windows 10 benchmarks, which if we don't have them all clustered into one chart, but if you looked at Windows 10, which I do, oh, he ran different games under Windows 10, so that's not going to quite work, I don't think. But basically, there's a lot more variation under Windows 10 where you can get much lower minimum frames per second but higher average frame rate. So there's a lot of factors that you're going to need to consider when you're looking to upgrade to Alder Lake. It's not a simple drop-in solution.
I mean, especially given the price difference between DDR4 and DDR5 and the fact that there aren't really high-end motherboards that have DDR4 at the moment, so it's interesting.
So Gone MMORPG and G says, missed the beginning. Is this for Windows 10 or Windows 11? So far, we have been talking about the Windows 11 results, but we will talk about the Windows 10 results shortly. Before that, though, let me go ahead and pull up the chart for it because we have a question about Flight Simulator. So I want to just go ahead, put that up over here. You mentioned Flight Simulator in the tested package. That would be interesting to see because some other testers, I won't name names, but other people might have achieved very weird results. So these don't look that weird to me. We see the DDR4 Core i9 higher than the DDR5 Core i9, which is a little weird, but you mentioned why that might be the case, Jared. And aside from that, RAM difference,
Well, it's
the
gonna
CPUs seem to stack how I would expect them to.
Yeah, and your memory choice, like it's going to be very interesting because basically DDR5 has higher bandwidth but worse latency, and so depending on how a game is designed, it might actually run faster with DDR4. Not because DDR4 is universally better, but I think Paul has like DDR4 3200 running at like CAS latency 14. The kit he's using for DDR5 is DDR5 5600 running at the official stock supported speed, which is DDR5 4400, and it's running with CAS latency 36. And it's not just CAS latency. Like, there's a lot of subtimings, but all of the subtimings tend to be higher, meaning worse on DDR5, and so like it does matter, especially for latency sensitive applications. So I think we'll see more games.
It matters from game to game,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yep.
Yeah.
And but the price difference is hard to ignore, right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I feel like if I was building a system now on this platform, I would try to go with DDR4. I mean, in part because I have memory that I could use, but also like overall, it seems like in most cases, like the performance is better, and I would just wait for the next generation and maybe think about, we don't know this, but like if there's a next generation of motherboards, once the platform has matured, once the RAM has matured, then maybe think about stepping up to DDR5 if there's more of a difference. But
and I mean, like, just flipping through the charts to run through them. So F1 2021, Paul and I talked about that. We're like, oh, we got to get rid of that. There's too much variation. It had higher performance, average frame rates on DDR4 just by like 2 frames per second, but much worse 99th percentile frame rates. So, basically tied, hopefully. Far Cry 6 favored DDR5 by almost 20 frames per second. Flight Simulator favored DDR4 by, 10% probably, give or take. Hitman 3, relatively close. They're only maybe 1 or 2% apart. And Horizon Zero Dawn, again, close, 1 or 2% difference. Red Dead Redemption 2 looks like DDR4 came out a couple percent ahead. So it's kind of hit and miss. The hard thing is, and Paul mentions this in the review, is the motherboard makers are basically putting their best foot forward for DDR5. So that's they pull out all the stops, put on all the bells and whistles, make a really nice motherboard. It's got a lot of layers, it's got a lot of complexity, a lot of extra features, And then on DDR4, they're going, that's the budget solution.
So we
Well,
have Matt looked at DDR5 motherboards. So Matt,
yeah,
any expertise you want to
I mean,
share?
the biggest thing that I would point out is that most of the motherboard makers now also sell RAM, right? So it's in their best interest to move to DDR5 because then they can
Yes.
sell you new RAM, right?
And would you rather sell people a $300 or $400 DDR5 board or a $200 or $150 DDR4 board? I bet Asus and MSI and Gigabyte and all the players are like, yeah, we'd prefer to sell you the ultra enthusiast board. So
sure.
So while I have us in this kind of roundtable format, we have another question from SpeedROM2. Do you think CAS latency for DDR5 will decrease, or is it an architecture feature?
I mean, it will decrease,
Yeah.
but you're never going to see like CL14 DDR5 memory running at 4600 or whatever speed, right? It's like DDR2. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I want to say like DDR2, it was pretty common to get like CL6, CL7, and the best DDR4 3200 memory you'll find is CL14, almost double the CL timings, but it also has higher bandwidth, and I think DDR5 is going to be a lot of the same. I think the lowest latency kits we're seeing right now are 36 on the CAS latency, but potentially, if that's at 5600, that's actually not that far off what you would get with DDR4 3200 CL14.
But there's
Mhm.
also all kinds of complications with the speeds you can run based on the number of ranks you have and the number of sticks you have. Like that's in that review. Like I'm used to things being complicated, but when I read that section, I was like, I need to sit like if I really want to internalize how this works, I need to sit and like meditate on it for like a half an hour. It was so complicated. I mean,
What
to
I
me, that's another reason why I would prefer to go to with DDR4 because you
Yes.
know what's going to work.
So just to quickly summarize, DDR4 boards, you can have 4 slots. You can populate all 4 slots. They can be single rank or dual rank DIMMs, and you can run DDR4 3200 on all of those slots. That's the official supported speed. So overclocking, I mean, I don't know, like overclocking, I've never had problems with DDR4 3600 on an i9 9900K or later. It's quite stable. But DDR5 may change things up a bit. Paul likes to run things at factory stock for, whatever's the official supported speeds are, just to keep it on a level playing field. So Intel officially says DDR5, if you have more than 2 slots on your motherboard, then you're limited to DDR5 4400 speeds. And there's also like, if you're using dual rank DIMMs instead of single rank DIMMs, it can change that. And if you have 4 slots, but you only populate 2, which I think is what he did, and that's why it's DDR5 4400. So if you have single slots, you can go to DDR5 4800, single rank or dual rank. If you have 4 slots, you're limited to DDR5 4400. If you populate all 4 slots, then you're limited to DDR5 4000 with single rank and 3600 with dual rank. So, like, you think about that, 4 DDR5 DIMMs running dual rank, you're now down to 3600. I'm running 3600 megahertz on my DDR4.
Yeah, you might as well stay with DDR4.
with much, much lower latencies. So,
And then to complicate things, you have all these companies already announcing like 7,000 hertz and like higher. Like,
yeah.
good luck figuring out. Like, I feel like I would need like a whiteboard and a bunch of string to figure out how I could get that to work at
Charlie
close
from
to those
It's Always Sunny. I've been dying to talk about the DDR5, but what is it? So here's the geomean test again for 1080p, and you can like see how much it varies from game to game, because DDR5 and DDR4 on the 12900K average out to the same thing right now.
It's a wash for the moment, at least in the games we tested. So
if you
and under Windows 10, this is also interesting. We can get to that maybe in a bit, but Windows 10 actually preferred DDR4.
If you get, so I'll pull up the Windows 10 charts, but I want to point out while I'm doing that, if you get a DDR5 motherboard, you can run DDR4 on it. So if
No,
money, oh, you can't? I thought you
no,
could.
no.
Oh no,
So
I'm thinking of the chips. I'm thinking of the chips.
yes,
I'm sorry.
the
The
chips
chips
support
support
both.
DDR4 and DDR5, but you're right. We mentioned this on last week's show. There's not combo DDR5 and DDR4 boards, and I keep forgetting because that has been the case for the past few generations.
Yeah. And the reason is that DDR5 has a whole bunch of new requirements, like there's onboard voltage controllers, and basically the signaling has to be a lot cleaner and tighter. And so the cost of creating a DDR5 board is expensive. And to try and then like do this hodgepodge where you're like, oh, and we'll have 2 more slots for DDR4, but you can only use one or the other. It's the motherboard makers just shook their head and they said, we're not even going to try that. It's all DDR5 or all DDR4, and you won't see a mix on the motherboards.
Thank you for keeping me honest, Jared, and for keeping me honest, Speedum too. Notice I've been mispronouncing your name the whole time. I was literally thinking of the chips. I apologize. But we were talking about Windows 10. So here's our Windows 10 GeoMean test suite at 1080p. And yeah, you see a pretty hefty difference between DDR4 and DDR5 performance here.
And it's important to note that the test suite for Windows 10 was different. So you can't just compare the numbers and go, well, Windows 11 got 175.
That was Hitman 2, Red Dead Redemption 2, Far Cry 5, etc.
Yeah, so Red Dead Redemption 2, I think, is an overlap, but almost everything else was different. And, you know, Paul has been busting his butt for the last week trying to do all this testing, and time just isn't on your side. I used to do CPU reviews, and it can be brutal, and especially with a thing like this where it's like, oh, guess what? You have to upgrade your operating system to make use of this chip. And yeah, that just creates a nightmare of testing. But you can use Alder Lake with Windows 10. It's just not preferred, and I think you'd be better off moving to Windows 11 and figuring out how to tweak the UI to not suck as bad. I mean, to be less painful.
let's talk about that. Actually, we do have 1440p gaming numbers, which we can go over later if we have that amount of time. As far as I remember, the ranking isn't that different. So let's move over to productivity, where you see a huge difference between Windows 11 performance and Windows 10 performance. So this is our multi-threaded Windows 11 performance. This is our, gotta find my mouse, single-threaded Windows 11 performance for productivity. And then Windows 10 was just so drastically different that Paul, our reviewer again, actually went ahead and gave us individual numbers for each chart because it just, we saw on Windows 11, Alder Lake was topping the chart, but here in Handbrake, it's at the bottom again. And I think that reason is because of Intel's Thread Director program. You can't use that on Windows 10, correct?
Yeah, it's not part of Windows 10. Like the OS has to know it. The Thread Director has load level access to the telemetry about like what's going on in the core, how hot's it running, how much data is it crunching through, like what do the needs of this thread appear to be. And there's probably a bunch of metrics that I didn't list here, but the idea is it looks at it and it pretty much sends a signal back to the OS, if the OS is listening, saying, hey, I think you should move this task to the P core, or hey, this task looks like a good fit for the E core. And that has to be, there has to be a communication between the chip and the OS. Otherwise, the chip is just talking to itself. And it looks like, at least in Handbrake, most likely the threads got scheduled in such a way that a bunch of the work is being done on the E cores, and it just kind of fell apart.
If I remember correctly, I think he said in the review that this is not less of an issue in X265 than 264. So again, I mean, I don't know. There's also the possibility that with updates, a lot of this stuff could change in a matter of weeks or months. But also, I mean, I think both Microsoft and Intel have a bigger vested interest in you being on Windows 11. So there's not a lot of impetus to fix the Windows 10 issues. I mean, they might, but I think they would rather have more people go to Windows 11. So
Actually,
And I
I was
haven't.
looking at this chart wrong. I was reading those as both 12900K, but obviously that's i5 and i9. So the i5s aren't as potent to begin with. I
Yeah.
guess that makes more sense in my brain now. It's like, wait, why is this?
But I
so
mean,
bad?
Ryzen 5 is still at 250, whereas i5 DDR5 or DDR4 is in the 560s, and in this case, lower is better.
Yeah,
So
like
that,
when you think about it, like there's no reason the 12900K shouldn't easily outperform an 11900K.
mhm.
And the fact that it's not just shows you how wrong things are going.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, if I were sticking to my guns about Windows 10, which I think a lot of people are, and I were not a gamer, would I be better off on 11th gen?
I mean, you'd be better off with a Zen 3 chip.
That's fair. That's fair. So I haven't pulled up all of the numbers for the individual productivity programs because I don't think we have a lot of Y cruncher heads out there. But here's a multi-threaded performance benchmark. Again, you see on Windows 10, the 12th gen chips are towards the bottom, and single-threaded performance benchmark about the same thing. And that seems to be because of faulty use of the cores or the
scheduling, yeah.
threads. Yeah.
It's probably partly that, and Y Cruncher is one of the few applications that uses AVX 512 if it's present. And so, like, even though the Golden Cove architecture supports AVX 512, and it will probably be used, well, it will certainly be used in the server chips when those come out. For the desktop chips, because the E-cores don't support AVX 512, Intel fused off the AVX 512 in the P-cores, and so you get AVX 256 or AVX 2 or whatever you want to call it support, but you don't get the boost of AVX 512. So that combined with scheduling is kind of a double whammy that really hurts Alder Lake.
Yeah.
On
And
Windows
because
10.
I kind of skipped past them to get to the Windows 10 bit, because that was the juicy part to me. Here's the Windows 11 performance again, and you can see here Alder Lake is back on top, just like with gaming. Again, gaming on Windows 11 and Windows 10, for whatever reason, Alder Lake is strong across the board, but productivity not quite the case. But Windows 11, because it has the proper use of thread scheduling, we see Alder Lake sort of taking the crown in both multi-thread and single thread.
I just when I see these charts, I envision the Windows or the Intel fans who had previously sworn off Windows 11, saying I was never going to update, and like
Now
sweating.
Like, no, I'm
curious because
the meme with the button. That's what I'm picturing.
I'm curious. I didn't have this on the schedule to talk about, but I guess it's important. Apple is dropping Intel now, going for its own M1 chips, and shortly after that, Intel released a whole ad campaign that was kind of a riff on the "I'm a Mac, I'm a PC" ads from back in the day, where they were like, "Please go PC," because now PC was synonymous with Intel. So do you think maybe that's any like reason for Intel really putting a lot of support behind Windows 11 and the new OS?
I mean, I'm sure that factors in. Yeah. I mean, I traditionally, this segment of like desktop and enthusiast users aside, usually when most users shift to new operating system, it involves buying a different computer.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, as I said earlier, it's both in Microsoft and Intel's best interest for more people to be on Windows 11, because that means they're going to sell more systems and more silicon, right? So I mean, just in the terms of that, they're definitely aiming in that direction for sure.
Exactly. I guess part what just popped in my head is like, if Windows 10 is having difficulty with the thread scheduling would, honestly, I'm not an Apple person, whatever OS they're on, have difficulty, but that's too speculative, I think.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, I think like Apple has had control of their hardware and software with Mac OS, and so they've been more willing to take a lot of chances on hardware, really. And so, they ditched Power PC and shifted to Intel. Oh gosh, I don't even remember when that was, like 2010 or 2009 or whatever. Um, and they stuck with Intel for a while. And then if you watch their smartphones, it's like they were using ARM chips designed by Qualcomm or whoever. And then at one point, I think it was like the iPhone 5, maybe 4, that they went, you know what? We can build a better chip than Qualcomm. And so they licensed the ARM architecture and they created their own chip for it. And everyone was like, oh, it's only a dual core. Samsung's doing like 4-core, 8-core. And yet the iPhone was generally competitive or faster in a lot of tasks. And then they iterated upon that. And when you get to the modern stuff, it's also like, oh, guess what? Apple has closed the gap with Intel. It's not like, I don't think Apple can win if you were to look at like this level of desktop performance, right? But when you're talking about laptops, the latest MacBooks running the M1 processors is like, yeah, they do what you need to do, and in a lot of things they're faster than an Intel chip just because Apple has optimized for it. So
let's talk about power and efficiency, which I guess is a good piggyback off the M1 chips because that's something that they're known for. Not that these are competing directly with
yes,
that, but these have efficiency cores, which supposedly should make them more efficient, but they're also super powerful and power hungry. So we have the handbrake power here, and less is better here. And we see the Core i5s are doing very well. So budget builds are maybe okay here. But the Core i9s are still drawing more power than the high-end Ryzens.
yeah, and there's a lot of things we need to talk about with power. Like there's performance per watt. There's also this question like, hey, what if you disable the P cores and just ran on the E cores? What does that look like? What if you disable the E cores and just run on the P cores? What's that look like? This is one of those things. I know Paul wants to look at this stuff, and you just need more time to get to it. Like Handbrake is known for maxing out CPU power, more or less. I mean, there's Y Cruncher probably uses a bit more power. At least it did when I last tested. But what's it look like when running games? I can guarantee most games aren't going to push a 12900K up to 213 watts. Like they're not so multi-threaded that they're loading the full chip. So I want to see what other tasks look like in terms of power. But I think the i5, it's interesting that it's like, well, it's not that much slower, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it uses half the power, and that's not unusual. Where as you get to the end of the voltage and frequency scaling range, all of a sudden you need a lot more voltage, which means a lot more power to get the last few hundred megahertz. So it's definitely not as power efficient as AMD's, but like there's some other charts. I don't know if you've got them up that show like kind of the renders per hour or something like that.
Yeah. I mean,
So I
that's what I
did
was going
not
to say.
save those ahead of time, I'll be honest, but I did save the handbrake power. Oh, actually, that is a renders per hour. Never mind.
Yeah,
Ignore
that's
me.
see, and the one where it's the scatter plot. That's the one I like, where it's like up and to the right is bad, down and to the left is good. And if you look at those charts, Rocket Lake was horrible. It was all the way up and to the right, and AMD's Ryzen chips were way down in the left corner. And now it's like there's differences, but Intel is at least competitive with Zen 3. So, it's definitely a move in the right direction for Intel. So,
I'll go ahead and look
Sure.
for those charts for a brief moment. But in something that I'm really interested in with these chips overall is the Core i5 in particular seem very strong against the Ryzen 5 5600X. I think it's $10 cheaper. It's got stronger performance in some area, and its power usage is, if we look at our last chart, a little more intense, but not like, actually it's about double. So never mind. But it just seems like budget builds are in a good place with this generation.
Yeah. I think
If only
I mean,
graphics cards were
yeah.
we're in line with that.
Yep. And you also have to look at, like, what's the rest of the system doing. Like, this is looking at just the CPU, but that doesn't mean that a Ryzen system uses 60 watts or 70 watts of power and the Intel system always uses 130. It's going to be, there's a lot of differences depending on what you're doing.
And I don't think this chart takes into account, time and like what, for a fixed task, like how fast it would be done, right? So like obviously an i9 is going to use much more power while it's doing something intensive, but it might be done in half the time as an i5 or a Ryzen 5. So, and then it's going to use a lot less power in the long run. So
Exactly. So I have those scatter charts that you were talking about pulled up, Jared. So let me go ahead and pull up one of them right now. So this is X264 power efficiency.
Yeah, so your best case is to do the task as fast as possible while using as little energy as possible. And you can see where like the 11900K is all the way up there in the top right, and the 11600K, 11700K, they're all up there as well. And then you've got like the Ryzen 9 5950X, it's way down in the left area, and the new Alder Lake stuff ends up being faster, but using more power. And it's like, well, more power is not good, but doing it faster is good. So it kind of ends up as like this wash where it's like, yeah, they're not necessarily better, but they're at least competitive.
This chart begs the question of how insane would the numbers be if AMD had efficiency cores mixed with performance cores, right?
Well,
I mean,
this seems like it's kind of setting a new standard to me. I wouldn't be surprised seeing that on the next AMD chip, right?
Yeah, well, not on Zen 4. I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure they're not going to do it on Zen 4, but Zen 5 maybe. Like I think ARM proved that a hybrid architecture was a smart way to go, because at some point throwing more cores at the problem really won't benefit laptops, and it won't benefit a lot of home users. So at some point you start going, well, maybe we need to have specialized cores, and that's what this is. They're going, hey, let's have some specialized cores. And the desktop sides, like, this is not even really showing Alder Lake in its best light, because the desktop, they're pushing for more performance and power is less of a concern. But I think when we see the laptops that are built on Alder Lake, it's going to look far more impressive.
And just for the sake of completion, this is the X265 power efficiency with handbrake. But you were talking about laptops, which cues in nicely with a viewer question from Ruru2M. When will these be in laptops? I'll admit I didn't have time to look that up. But do we know anything about 12th gen laptop CPUs yet?
I mean, they're not announced or released, but
the easy answer is probably next year. Yes.
Yeah,
CES,
probably next year.
them.
Well, we have a few months until next year, right?
Yeah, it's not far till next year, but I would assume next year at some point.
Right, but we do have 10 nanometer in laptops already.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that we'll start seeing laptops with Alder Lake in January would be great. February or March seems more likely.
Yeah, CES seems almost a little too
I think they'll show up there. I don't know. I don't know if it will launch, but I wouldn't be surprised if you've got companies going, this is an undisclosed CPU.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
The MSI will have some laptops that it will just say, oh, it's running next-gen Intel.
Yeah.
I always love that. So I think that's all of the benchmarks that I had to show off. So let me go ahead and pull up our favorite specs and pricing chart again. But yeah, now that we've sort of gone through all the different use cases, yeah, let's say I'm a gamer and I want to build the coolest high-end build and I want Intel in my machine. What do you think I should go for?
Whatever graphics card you can afford. Like, I mean, this is the hard thing is like before we talk about what you need, it's like, well, what do you have?
Yep.
And you know, honestly, if you're running anything, even Zen 2, or later, or I would say 8th gen Intel or later. If you've got either of those, and you've got a not extreme GPU, like not the 3090, maybe not even the 3080, but something like a 2080, you're probably fine. You lose a few percent. If you're gaming at 1440p, you lose even less, right? So it's really a question of like if your old system is sold and you're like, I've got to upgrade everything, then it opens the door to like, do you go AMD? Do you go Intel? What GPU can you still find? Because that's, you're probably going to have to go to eBay or similar. Or I guess if you get a pre-built, and that kind of sucks because you're like, well, what if I'm an enthusiast and I want to build my own? It's like, well, sorry, it's a lot cheaper to just buy a pre-built for the graphics card purpose. But yeah, I think if forgetting graphics card prices and forgetting what hardware you're already running, if I were to go out today to build a new PC, you've got to at least consider Alder Lake. Maybe you don't go there because either the DDR5 prices and you want DDR5 and it's too high, or availability is not good, or whatever. But if I were looking at a 5900X versus an 12900K, and they had similar GPUs and everything else, and they were both running DDR4 and they were the same price, I think I'd go for the Alder Lake. If the Intel one's like $300-400 more, I'd probably go, you know what, I don't need to spend extra for the last few percent. So it
I
will
mean,
really depend on what the
yeah.
full picture looks like.
No, and I mean, if you have something that's like not terrible right now and you can wait 5-6 months, I mean, we can see what AMD will do with the 3D V-cache chips, and
Yeah.
DDR5 might mature a little bit. The price might come down a little bit by then. I mean, at least there'll be more availability. I mean, as as interesting in a lot of ways as these chips are, and the Z690 platform is, it's also to me kind of interesting because we've seen sort of the traditional roles of Intel and AMD flip and flop so much in the last 5 years or so, and it also feels like they're doing it again in the sense that you know some of the biggest selling points of Z690 are DDR5 support and PCIe 5, which we haven't really talked about. And both of those things are nice, but they don't really feel ready yet. There are no PCIe 5 SSDs yet.
Or
And
graphics cards.
yes, and the RAM is kind of available, but really expensive and higher latency. So I mean, it kind of reminds me of like where in the past where like AMD has been with like HBM, or like they've kind of gotten ahead of where the software is and maybe where affordability is, and so it's like cutting edge hardware, but we can't really take full advantage of it yet. And it'll be interesting to see where accompanying hardware and the software is in 6 months or so after this platform has matured a bit. So
Right.
Yeah, and
So
and
we haven't talked about PCIe 5 because like we haven't been able to benchmark it, but I suppose that would provide some future proofing for the chip maybe, but you can say that for anything.
yeah, I mean, the reality is for home users, sorry, not DDR4, PCIe Gen 4 is already fast enough for,
yep.
like, if someone tells me that they need a Gen 4 PCI Express SSD, it's like, well, what are you doing? I'm like, because I'm still using Gen 3 on my test beds, and there are things that could be faster, but it's not like it really hurts because, loading games, we're still not seeing direct storage stuff where it
Yep.
goes straight to the SSD. So, I've seen a lot of tests where it's like, oh, well, loading this game off a SATA SSD compared to a Gen 4 SSD, and there's like a 2-second difference or less. And so it's like, well, that's not going to matter. Booting Windows, usually there's so much other stuff happening. So it's like, if you're copying lots of files, yeah, but I mean, even with a 2 terabyte drive, it's like, how many files do you copy before you're like, well, the whole drive's filled up, so now I'm just copying files to make myself feel faster. This, like, Gen 5 PCI Express is totally built for servers and data centers where, they have workloads that are constantly reading and writing to an SSD all day long, every day for 5 years. And home users just don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, it will give you more overall bandwidth in terms of like if you're the type of person that's going to build a system and want to install like 8 drives and have 4 of them be really fast and maybe multiple, not necessarily multiple GPUs, but multiple cards. If you're the type that really like packs the system in with like, which has traditionally been like an HEDT user, right? So I mean, there is a lot more bandwidth on that side that lets you plug in a lot more things without disabling other things and stuff. But then it also begs the question of like, is there a market anymore for whatever the next generation of HEDT is going to be, because there's like what is it going to offer, because there's so much PCIe bandwidth on Z690 right now.
I almost feel like Intel was holding back on their mainstream platform because they didn't want to cannibalize HEDT and workstation sales, and basically AMD did it for them.
Yes.
It's like there are people who need Threadripper, but for every Threadripper person, like needed Threadripper person, there's going to be like 99 or 1,000 people that are like, no, the 5900X, 5950X is more than enough. And I think that was HEDT as well. And so, we're getting to this stage where it's like, I think your traditional workstations are rapidly becoming, unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. So we do have one viewer question before we head out. I think this one might be best for Matt because he's the one who's looked at the motherboards the most. But are there B or H MOBO model of the 600 chipset for budget i5 builds?
I mean, there will be.
Yeah.
There isn't now. I don't know
in
when.
January.
Yes.
But that actually does raise a good question, which is stock for these things. Because, Ryzen's 5000 series chips have gotten to a point where you can buy them now, although that wasn't the case at launch. Intel's
or
got
for a
its
long
own,
time after launch.
yeah.
Yeah.
Intel's got its own fabs. And, we've seen them selling for $1,600 on Amazon, like you said. But a big part of the appeal of these chips is that aggressive pricing. So, how long do you think I'd have to wait if I wanted to buy one of these chips at MSRP?
From what we understand, Intel is cranking out a lot. Like, I think Paul said that Intel gave them a number of like 2 million chips have already been made. That may not be 100% accurate, so take that with a grain of salt. But, there's a lot of chips out there, and Intel also said that they have 32 different SKUs shipping to OEMs right now. I don't know if those are laptop and desktop or desktop only. I would assume it's both, but there's a lot of chips that are being made. They're just launching it. I mean, it's partly because Intel wants to say, hey, we launched in 2021. And they also want to catch the Christmas buyers and all that stuff. And so, it's good to launch your highest cost, highest performance parts in
Same
November.
thing with the chipsets. That's why there aren't the lesser ones yet, because they know they'll sell a lot of the expensive ones.
Where you go to the Christmas tree and unwrap a present and it's a new CPU.
You mean Paul's household?
Yeah. I had someone asking me, they were talking like, this was last year, and they're like, hey, I want to get my son a graphics card. I really want to get him a 3080 for Christmas. And I'm like, 3080? Like, I don't know about you guys, but like my family wasn't wealthy, and our budget for Christmas, usually it was like $150 or less. So I'm like, even at their MSRP of $700, like that's crazy to me to get for Christmas. And, even last Christmas they were selling for well over 1,000. Now they're
And
like
then you got to make sure
1,600.
that the rest of the PCU is
Yeah.
or PC is compatible with
Yes.
it and is also not just like so weak that you might as well not use a 3080 because you're not going to get the most out of it.
I kind of feel like if the parent knows what a 3080 is, the parent wants the 3080.
There's that. There's that.
Yeah.
Well, and this same person was like, or should I just get him an Alienware? And I'm like, don't even talk to me. If you've got that much money to burn.
Well, on that note, I guess we have reached the hour. So thank you so much for joining us and for the questions chat. Thanks so much for looking at our benchmarks. I guess now you know what to maybe put underneath your tree or next to your menorah or whatever you celebrate or don't for Christmas. Or maybe what not, because who gives people CPUs and graphics cards for Christmas? Readers of Tom's Hardware. That's who.
That's right. Hi,
So
honey. Merry Christmas.
so to see more benchmarks and to read more Tom's Hardware, please visit our site, tomshardware.com, and you'll see be able to read our full review of the Core i9 and Core i5 12th gen, complete with individual benchmark charts for all the different games and productivity programs we tested. Any final words, guys?
Paul didn't even test the integrated XE graphics. I'm so disappointed.
There will be
For the
much,
record, they're the same as what's in Rocket Lake. They might clock a little bit higher, but they're not super high end.
there will be more benchmarks to come.
Overclocking.
Yep. Look forward to overclocking. We wanted to do the sort of out of the box settings for our initial review, but there's plenty more to test with these chips. Don't worry. So
Yes.
on that note, you can see the Tom's Hardware Show again next week, next Thursday at 3 p.m. Where we'll be talking about, I don't know, we'll announce it shortly before on our social media. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
And let me go ahead and play